It's raining again. To be honest, I'm terrified of rain. I never leave the house when the sky is storming, but I wasn't always this way. I used to love watching the rain trickle down my windows, following the drops as they raced each other down the glass. Now my curtains are always pulled tight, blocking out any sight of the storm outside. I wish I could show you what made me like this, partly to warn you, but also to make you understand. Unfortunately, I can't do that. All I can do is tell you my story like some bizarre fantasy that might sound unbelievable. Maybe you'll hear it, shrug it off, and forget it in a week. That's fine if you do, but I won't forget. I can't forget. In 2012, I was a 21-year-old college student. I was in love with nature, the wild, the untamed. Ever since childhood, I'd spent my days roaming the woods, daydreaming about mythical creatures and monsters hiding in the trees. By the time I got to college, that fascination had grown into a passion. I was studying forestry, and my dream was to protect those forests, those trees that held my childhood fantasies. One day, my professor announced an opportunity for extra credit. He suggested we spend a few days over the upcoming break exploring some trails to remind ourselves why we chose this path in the first place. As an avid hiker, I was already familiar with a secluded trail about a few hours from campus. It had plenty of space to explore, and best of all, it was quiet. Most of the time, the only people you'd see out there were the occasional park rangers, and even they were rare on the remote trails I liked to wander. After class that day, I turned to my friend Lily. "Hey Lily, want to go down to the preserve with me during break?" I asked as the bell rang, signaling the end of class. Lily, who sat beside me, was quiet and sweet, with long brunette hair that hung just past her shoulders. Her green eyes always seemed soft, like they saw everything but judged nothing. She wasn't the type to speak much, only giving small smiles in response to passing compliments or jokes. But to me, her silence was a mystery I wanted to understand. We'd been friends for a while by then, and while I wasn't sure if there was any romantic tension between us, I knew we connected in a way that felt deeper than most friendships. Lily gave me one of those soft smiles when I asked her to come. "Yeah, of course," she said, her green eyes meeting mine. "Just let me know when." A few days later, we found ourselves gathering supplies, food, tents, and other essentials. Soon enough, we were packed and ready to hit the road. We loaded our gear onto the roof of my small car and drove east, the highway stretching before us. By the time we reached the trailhead, the afternoon sun was already starting its slow descent. The place was busier than I expected, with people walking dogs, setting up picnics, and strolling along the easier paths. Lily raised an eyebrow and let out a small laugh. "I thought you said it'd be quiet." I rolled my eyes. "Give it time. I doubt most of these people are planning to hike for more than a few minutes." We parked, and I got out, untying the large packs from the roof of the car. Despite their size, they were surprisingly light. Lily slung her pack over her shoulders and waited for me to lead the way. As we approached the entrance to the trail, a park ranger stood by, leaning casually against a post. "You two heading in?" he asked, his tone friendly and relaxed. "Yeah, that's the plan," I replied, nodding toward him. "Good," he said with a smile. "Just let me know your names and take my card. If you need anything, you can call down to the station. There are a couple of ranger shacks deeper in if you need shelter. Just make sure to leave them as you find them." I took the card he handed me and smiled back. "Thanks. I'm Max, and this is Lily." Lily gave him a polite nod. The ranger returned the gesture. "Well, Max and Lily, enjoy yourselves out there. We'll be patrolling, so don't be afraid to say hi if you see us." With that, he stepped aside, and we started our hike. The first few hours were peaceful. We walked in quiet appreciation, soaking in the beauty around us. There's something about being out in the wilderness with no time limit. It's like the weight of the world melts away, leaving you free to just exist in the moment. No worries, no deadlines, just you, the trees, and the trail. By late afternoon, the sun was starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the path. The air had cooled, the warmth of the day slowly giving way to the crispness of evening. Lily glanced around and then looked at me. "We should find a spot to set up camp," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of excitement. I nodded and spotted a small clearing off the path that looked perfect for our tents. It only took a few minutes to set everything up, and soon we had a small fire going in the center of our camp. Lily sat down across from me, pulling a granola bar from her pack. "This place is beautiful," she said, taking a bite and glancing around. "Yeah," I agreed, unwrapping my own snack. "Though, I haven't seen many animals yet." I lifted the granola bar to my lips, ready to take a bite, but something made me pause. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the darkening forest, just behind Lily. It was small, about the size of a football, and it was crouched in the shadows, barely visible. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. But whatever it was seemed to fade out of existence, sinking straight into the ground like it had never been there in the first place. I must have looked strange, frozen mid-bite, staring blankly ahead with food half in my mouth. "Everything all right?" Lily asked, her voice pulling me back to reality. I laughed awkwardly, shaking my head. "Yeah, sorry. I thought I saw something in the woods, an animal maybe. But it was small, probably a rabbit or something. It burrowed into the ground pretty fast." Lily glanced over her shoulder into the dense, silent forest, her eyes scanning the darkening tree line. I knew she wouldn't see anything. Whatever I had spotted was long gone. As quickly as I had caught sight of it, it had vanished. We finished our meal without further incident, the sounds of the forest settling around us like a warm blanket. The fire crackled softly, and the stillness that followed calmed me, even though that strange shadow still lingered in the back of my mind. With the fire extinguished and the night fully upon us, we climbed into our separate tents, ready to rest. I slept like a log. All that walking had knocked me out cold, and by the time I woke up, the morning sun was already high in the sky, its heat and humidity slamming into me as I crawled out of my tent. I squinted at the sudden brightness, wiping the sweat from my brow. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. "Just so you know," Lily said softly, "we should probably watch out for snakes." I looked over at her, halfway through dismantling her tent. "Did you see one?" She shook her head, though she didn't seem overly bothered by the thought. "I didn't see it exactly, but I heard something rubbing against my tent last night." I opened my eyes, and I saw an indentation in the fabric, like something was slithering along the edge. It had to be a pretty thick snake trying to worm its way in. I shivered at the thought, but tried to brush it off. She didn't seem particularly alarmed, so I kept her warning in mind as we continued cleaning up camp. But the thought of something slithering along my tent while I slept sent a wave of discomfort crawling up my spine. As we packed up, I glanced at the sky. Dark clouds had begun gathering on the horizon, swirling together like ink in water. It was odd because the forecast hadn't mentioned any storms, yet here we were, standing beneath an increasingly menacing sky. "How much longer until it rains?" Lily started to ask, but her question was interrupted by a sharp crack of thunder that reverberated through the air. The ground beneath us trembled slightly, as though nature itself had taken a deep breath before releasing a few tentative raindrops. Well, there's your answer, I said with a smirk, arching an eyebrow at Lily. She scoffed playfully, and I laughed, but the humor was short-lived. The rain, at first just a light drizzle, quickly picked up speed, and it became clear that we were in for something much worse. "We need to find shelter," Lily said, quickening her pace as she started jogging down the trail, her footsteps growing more urgent. I followed close behind, feeling the cold rain seep through my clothes as the skies opened up with a roar. For a while, it seemed like we wouldn't find anywhere to take cover. The rain fell harder, pounding against the earth with enough force to create little explosions of water at every impact. I was already soaked to the bone, the storm's relentless downpour showing no signs of stopping. "Over there." Lily's voice barely rose above the storm's cacophony, but I caught sight of her veering off the main path toward a narrow side trail. She was heading toward a small, weathered cabin nestled in the trees. I followed her, each step more difficult as the muddy ground squelched beneath my feet, threatening to suck me down. I tried to pick up speed to match Lily's light-footed sprint, but my foot suddenly snagged on something. My momentum threw me forward, and I tumbled face first into the mud, my body crashing into the wet ground with a splat. For a few moments, I just lay there, dazed and disoriented, my face half buried in the muck. My hands sank into the slop as I pushed myself up, wiping the mud from my eyes. I glanced down at my feet and saw what had tripped me, a thin, dark root sticking out of the mud. Except, it wasn't a root. The mud shimmered as water rushed over it, and I watched, frozen in place, as the root shifted ever so slightly, slithering just beneath the surface of the muck. It dawned on me in a flash. Lily's snakes. I had tripped over one of them. A cold shiver raced down my spine, and I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My heart was pounding as I glanced around, half expecting more of them to start wriggling out of the ground. But nothing else moved. Without a second thought, I sprinted toward the cabin, leaving the snake behind in the mud. I wasn't about to stick around and see what it might do next. By the time I reached the cabin, I was completely soaked, my clothes clinging to me like a second skin. I burst through the door, finally free from the storm's fury. "Wow," Lily's voice rang out, amusement clear in her tone. I looked over to see her standing near the stove, only slightly damp compared to my mud-covered state. She was smiling, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Decided to take a mud bath out there? Haha, very funny," I muttered, looking down at myself. Mud dripped from every part of me, forming little puddles around my feet. I think I ran into one of those snakes you mentioned. It gave me quite the trip, literally. "Oh, really?" Lily said, walking over and rummaging through my pack. "Well, you're right. They're pretty thick. I wonder what kind they are. They can't be venomous if they're that wide, right?" I stood still as Lily pulled a towel out of my pack and handed it to me, grateful for something to clean myself up with. As I wiped the mud from my face and arms, I took a moment to glance around the cabin. It was simple, wooden, and looked like it hadn't been used in a while. There was a small stove in one corner, and not much else. The space was sparse, clearly meant for quick overnight stays rather than long-term comfort. "Thanks," I said, wiping more mud from my skin as Lily continued setting up her things. I walked over to one of the windows, watching as the storm raged on outside. The rain was relentless, hammering the earth with such intensity that the ground had turned into a series of flowing mud rivers. The forest had transformed into a wetland, the trails nearly unrecognizable under the downpour. "It looks awful out there," I remarked, my eyes following the winding rivers of mud as they snaked through the trees. Lily let out a small grunt of agreement from behind me, busy with her gear. I let my gaze wander, scanning the path we had taken to get here. But then I saw it right where I had tripped. Something was sticking out of the ground, partially submerged in the mud. It wasn't the snake I had assumed it was earlier. No, this was something else, something much worse. I rubbed the window, trying to clear away the fog and rain obstructing my view. It was hard to see through the sheets of water, but there, just barely visible, was a thick, mud-covered object. It looked like a branch, snapped off and sticking up out of the ground. But as I squinted harder, I realized it wasn't a branch at all. "Lily, come here," I called out, my voice unsteady. "You need to see this." Lily walked over, curiosity etched on her face. "Is it the snake?" "I don't think so," I said, my eyes fixed on the object. "It looks weird." Lily peered out the window, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. "Is that a tree root?" she suggested. I shrugged, unsure. "Maybe, but look at the color." The rain continued to wash the mud away, revealing more and more of the objects. As the muck slid off, the true color became clear, a sickly, pale gray. "Oh my God," Lily whispered, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. "What?" I asked, my stomach tightening at the look of horror on her face. "Look at the end of it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned my attention back to the object, squinting through the rain. That's when I saw its fingers. Pale, lifeless fingers, reaching up from the mud as though frozen in place. My blood ran cold. "It's an arm," I said, my voice shaking. "It's a freaking arm." Lily's face had turned ashen, but she didn't waste any time. "We need to call the Rangers. Now." She reached for the business card we'd gotten earlier, her hand trembling as she dialed the number. "Hello, we need to report something on one of the trails," she said, pacing nervously as she spoke. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the arm. It was so still, so eerily lifeless, fingers outstretched toward the sky as rain continued to wash over it. Lily began to stutter, her words trailing off in hesitation. "We're at, the voice on the other side of the phone chirped up again, urging her for more information. Lily gave me a quick nod. "Hey Max, can you step outside and tell me what number's next to the door?" I reluctantly peeled my eyes away from the eerie sight of the arm sticking out of the mud. A strange, oppressive air seemed to press its way inside the cabin, filling the space with a growing sense of unease. But I shook off the feeling and walked to the door. I pulled it open, stepping outside into the pouring rain. The sound of the storm surrounded me as I peered toward the spot where the arm had been. Without the blurry window between us, I could see it more clearly. The arm was hairless, smooth, and the fingernails were surprisingly clean and trimmed. The rain that poured over it almost seemed to vanish on contact, as if the skin absorbed the water like a sponge. I forced myself to look away and focus on the number etched into the wooden wall of the cabin. 17, I muttered under my breath, repeating the number in my head to make sure I didn't forget it. I turned to head back inside when a loud clap echoed behind me, causing me to jump. I quickly turned back toward the arm, but it was gone. In its place was just the muddy trail, water rushing down the path in torrents. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing as I rushed back inside. "The number's 17, I said, breathless. "But the arm, it's not there anymore." "I think it fell back into the mud." Lily's eyes went wide as she relayed the new information to the dispatcher. After a few tense moments, she pulled the phone away from her ear and hung up. "They told us to stay put," she said, her voice tight with concern. "The storm isn't going to pass anytime soon. A ranger is on the way, and they've alerted the police." but it might take a while for them to reach us out here. I bit my lip, glancing nervously out the window at the now empty path. I hope the current didn't drag it away, I mumbled, a sick feeling gnawing at my gut. Lily joined me at the window, her face pale as she stared out into the storm. I'm sure they'll be able to follow the mud slick down to wherever it goes, she said, trying to sound reassuring. On the bright side, the rain cleaned you up a bit. She offered a small smile, and I looked down at myself. My clothes were still caked with mud, but my skin was cleaner, the rain having washed away the worst of the grime. I guess that's something, I replied, though the heaviness in the air made it hard to joke. Come on, Lily said, her voice a little more upbeat. Let's make ourselves at home at least. I'll lock the door, just in case. Well, you know, in case there's a killer out there? I muttered, raising an eyebrow at her. She didn't respond, just flipped the lock on the door with a swift motion, her expression tight as she busied herself with setting up our gear. After a few minutes of silent tension, we laid out some food and ate, though neither of us had much of an appetite. We'll pack up as soon as the ranger gets here, I said between bites. I've had enough of this place. We've seen more in the past 2 days than most people see in a lifetime. Lily nodded in agreement, chewing slowly, her eyes still darting toward the window every few seconds. I could sense her anxiety growing, and it made the small cabin feel even more claustrophobic. Everything okay? I asked, my voice soft. Lily shook her head. I don't know. I feel weird. Like I'm being watched. She paused, then got up and ripped off her pillowcase, grabbing mine too. I'm going to cover the windows. I don't want anything looking in at us while we sleep. I couldn't blame her. Good idea, I said, my voice quiet. I settled into my bedroll as she draped the pillowcases over the windows. Even though it blocked our view of the outside, I felt a little safer, knowing that whatever might be out there couldn't see us either. A few hours into the night, I awoke to Lily shaking my arm, her voice a frantic whisper. Max, wake up. Do you hear that? I opened my eyes, surprisingly alert despite the fog of sleep. I met Lily's terrified gaze and followed it to the wooden door of the cabin. The handle was jiggling, slowly at first, then with more force. Someone or something was trying to get in. What do we do? Lily asked, her voice trembling. I was speechless, my heart racing. I opened my mouth to say maybe it was the ranger, but the thought was cut short by a loud, heavy knock on the door. The sound reverberated through the cabin, shaking the walls. I jumped to my feet, glancing at Lily. It's got to be the cops, I muttered, my voice barely convincing. I took slow, cautious steps toward the door. Hello, who's out there? I called, hoping for an answer. Nothing. Hello? I yelled again, louder this time. The response was immediate, another series of loud bangs, each one louder than the last. The force of the knocks shook the door in its frame, making the cabin shudder. I took a step back, my hand trembling as I reached for the door handle. But before I could touch it, one of the pillowcases slipped off the window, falling to the floor with a soft thud. Lily gasped, her voice barely a whisper. No! I rushed to cover the window again, but as I reached for the fabric, I froze. A pale, wet hand appeared, slapping against the glass with a loud smack. The fingers spread wide, pressing against the window, leaving trails of water in their wake. It was the same hand, the one from the mud. I quickly threw the pillowcase back over the window and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. That's the hand, Max, Lily whispered, tears welling in her eyes. That's the same hand. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close as we both stared at the window. the slapping sound continuing in a slow, eerie rhythm. The glass creaked under the pressure, tiny cracks spreading across the surface. I held on to Lily tighter, trying to keep my own fear at bay, hoping the glass wouldn't shatter. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the slapping stopped. A bright light flashed through the fabric covering the window, and I heard the rumble of a vehicle pulling up outside the cabin. Relief washed over me like a wave, and I whispered a silent prayer. The Rangers were here. "Lily, Max, you in there?" A familiar voice called out from the darkness, muffled by the storm. It was the Ranger from the day before. I jumped to my feet, dragging Lily with me. "Yeah, we're inside," I yelled, rushing to the door. But someone was out there. They were banging on the door. I threw the door open, but the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The Ranger stood in the middle of the clearing, facing us. His body was rigid, his posture unnatural. The lights from his vehicle cast long shadows over his face, but something was wrong. "Come on out," the Ranger said, his voice disjointed, like it didn't belong to him. "We'll get you home now." I hesitated, something deep inside me screaming that this wasn't right. His voice didn't sound like it had earlier. It was off, like a bad recording. I took a step back. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The Ranger tilted his head, his movements jerky and wrong. "Of course I am," he said, his voice even stranger. "Can't you see my smile?" As he spoke, his head tilted back even further, and his hat slipped from his head. The lights from the vehicle illuminated his face, and my heart nearly stopped. His eyes were wide with fear, his lips stretched into a grotesque grin by two impossibly long fingers that had curled around his face from behind. The fingers pulled his lips upward, stretching them unnaturally far until his skin began to tear, blood spilling from the corners of his mouth. "I'm so perfectly happy," a thick, unnatural voice called out from behind the Ranger. I stepped back in horror, my gaze darting downward to where the voice had come from. There, half submerged in the mud, was a human face, its cold black eyes staring straight at me. More long, spider-like arms stretched out from the earth around it, slithering toward the Ranger's body. The Ranger twitched violently, his body convulsing as the hands wrapped around him. Without another word, the hands yanked him down into the mud, his body disappearing into the earth like he had never been there. The ground bubbled and shifted where he had been standing, and the creature's black, soulless eyes locked onto mine. "Lily, run!" I screamed, grabbing her hand. We bolted toward the Ranger's vehicle, the mud slick beneath our feet threatening to pull us down with every step. We barely made it to the vehicle before I slammed the door shut and hit the gas. We drove in silence, the cabin shrinking into the distance behind us. Neither of us looked back. But even now, every time it rains, I wonder if that face is still out there, waiting, watching, hungry,